Well, today we're going to look at the difference between the Canon R5 Mark II and the Canon R5. I'm going to show you what, with my use of the Canon R5 in the past and the Canon R5 Mark II in the last several weeks, what I think the differences are, and really how much of an upgrade is this camera, and should you upgrade your Canon R5. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to move to a spot where I can sit down to discuss all this. So let's go do that, and then let's talk about it. Well, today I'm coming to you from the top of the Chugach Mountains here in Alaska, and fall is upon us up here. The trees are changing colors. It is gorgeous up here now. But what we're going to talk about today is not about the fall colors here in Alaska. We're going to be talking about the Canon R5 Mark II and the Canon R5. So the Canon R5 came out in July of 2020. Now, at the time it came out, to me, it was one of the best autofocuses on the market. And to be honest with you, compared to a lot of cameras that are still in the market, it still has one of the best autofocuses out there. Really, really good. The camera really revolutionized how I shoot. It really changed how I shoot, moving from DSLR into a mirrorless world, especially with that autofocus. For the first time, you were able to get autofocus much easier, higher frame rates, and be able to frame your picture and not worry about where the focus was, because you knew the autofocus was going to snap and get it. And the image quality was just amazing. It's a camera that I really loved for many, many years. Of course, yes, I did move into the Nikon Z9 world just to move up in quality of cameras and with the sensors and things like that. But the R5 is still, every time I came back to it, was just almost right on par with that Z9. But then we got the Canon R5 Mark II. And what we want to know really in a future video, not this video, is how does this Canon R5 Mark II stack up to that Z9 and the Z8, which are basically the same camera, because they both, the Z8, Z9 have the same autofocus setup, same sensor, same processor, same everything in them. They just, one has a grip, one doesn't have a grip, different types of batteries. But that's the main difference of the two right now as they sit. What we're going to look at today is this R5 Mark II versus that R5. So both cameras have a 45 megapixel sensor. The difference in those sensors, though, is really huge. The Canon R5 has a 45 megapixel CMOS sensor, and this Mark II has a 45 megapixel backside illuminated stacked sensor. And both have DigicX processors inside of them, but the Mark II has a Digic accelerator paired with that DigicX processor, which handles the processing of huge amounts of data for the new backside illuminated stacked sensor, and performs a high-level analysis for the processing of the image, subject recognition, and the focus. So that new accelerator is what really helps this camera, the Mark II, do some things that the Canon R5 couldn't do. And both cameras have a similar feel in the hand. Not much has really changed here. The Canon R5 Mark II's grip is a little bit thicker, but the weight is almost exactly the same on these two cameras, just a little bit off, with this one weighing, the Mark II, just a little bit less. As far as the button layout, there's only a couple differences on both of these two cameras. On the R5, your on-off switch is on the left side of the camera, and your video, when you switch to video stills, you would have to accomplish either through the mode dial or assign some buttons on the camera to jump between stills and video. As far as the R5 Mark II, you now have your on-off switch on the right and a lock click in the middle. Before, you on the R5, you had to hit a button to do your lock, to lock your exposure and everything. And on the R5 Mark II, you have a stills video switch on the left. You can still assign buttons to jump between those two, so it's not much of a big deal. As far as if you want to set it up like your R5, you can, but I like having that dedicated switch on the side so I know where I'm at and what I'm into and what settings I'm going to have when I flip that switch. Now for the ports of this camera, we have two really big additions to me. One is a full-size HDMI out. To me, that is really incredible for what I do, because I use HDMI out a lot to record to recorders or do monitors, things like that. And with the micro ones, you get a jiggle in there. They can break, they can bend real easy. A full size is not going to do that. I even have a camera where the mini HDMI has gotten so loose that the jack in the camera that half the time it doesn't even work. And that full size is really good for my workflow. The second thing is the USB-C upgrade that's in this camera in the Mark II. The R5 had a USB-C 3.1 is what its generation was, which is 5 gigabits a second. This R5 Mark II has USB-C 3.2 Gen 2, which is 20 gigabits a second. So it's really nice when you need to transfer things on and off from this camera, off the camera, or putting updates and things onto the camera. Just much, much better going from 5 to 20 gigabits a second. You can really tell that difference when you're transferring data. As far as the LCD screen, we get a flippy screen on both cameras, and neither one of them are much different. They're really exactly the same touch screen, nothing different really. Not much really to say about that. So now let's move on to the EVF of this camera. Next thing we're going to talk about. On paper, the two EVFs are exactly the same. They're both a half-inch display, OLED display. They're both 0.76 magnification, both 5.7 million dots, exactly the same. But with this guy, it is much, much brighter and much clearer. When I set the R5 to max brightness and this guy default, this was still brighter and clearer than the R5 Mark II was. This really, to me, is a huge creature comfort when shooting. When shooting sandhill cranes in flight and so light on the R5, I can see the crane flying and they look like they're almost solid gray. In the R5 Mark II, I could see the lighter gray of the bird and the brown in the feathers and the shoulders and just see more features in there. And those type of things is what made it a lot better. It just makes getting that exposure easier and just that quality of life experience while being behind this lens and behind the camera much, much more enjoyable. And this larger eyepiece just made it much easier to get in those low and variable angles when you're really getting low and trying to look through that eyepiece. It makes it a lot easier with that angle, so the parallax is not so bad when you're trying to do that. And really, again, like the larger eyepiece, why it's larger, again, is because that eye control feature that they have with this camera. Canon also claims that there's less fogging in the Mark II EVF. And to me, that seems to be true, as I had some really cold and wet weather and up in Barrow when I was up there because it's 30 degrees and snowing and raining and just moist all day long, and it never fogged up. And the R5, through past history, from time to time, it did, in that same type of weather, it would fog up a little bit from time to time. So I do believe their claim that this fogs up a lot less on this EVF in this guy. But the main thing with this EVF to me was just that clarity and the brightness in the screen. It's something that Don and I kept coming back to. We would go between the two cameras. Is how much better that clarity and that brightness was, and how much better and much more we like shooting this camera over the R5 just for due to that one feature alone. Now let's talk about the new battery that's in this camera versus the old battery. So Canon states a 20% increase in battery life. To me, it probably seems it was a little bit better, but I really couldn't really tell in my day. I didn't really feel like I was getting a lot more time out of the batteries in here. I didn't run a test of how long it took me to run the R5 out or how long it took me to run the R5 Mark II out, because in the sessions I was shooting the two, I never ran out of the battery on either one of them. But to me, that claim is probably pretty close, but you know, like I said, go test it yourself, and I'm sure some people have tests out there to talk about that. Now, the batteries are forward and backwards compatible. The backwards compatible part does have some caveats. So if you're trying to use your R5 batteries in your R5 Mark II, it's going to dumb down the camera. What are those features that it dumbs down? Well, if you use one of those batteries, you're going to get no pre-continuous shooting, which means, you know, when you half hold the press the shutter, you get those shots before you hit the shutter. And in video, you're only going to get 30 frames per second, up to 4K for resolution. You can shoot 30 frames a second. You can't shoot 24, you can't shoot 120, 60, none of that. You can only shoot up to 4K and only 30 frames a second as far as your frame rate goes. So just be aware, that's the way it works. So you do need to buy more batteries for your R5 Mark II. Pick one up. You can't really rely on using your R5 batteries in this camera because it just will really probably influence or detriment to your workflow for that day out shooting. On to the sensor, which is another major change in this camera. The R5 has a CMOS sensor versus the Mark II has a backside eliminated stack sensor, which means help with light gathering, color, noise reduction, and faster signals to and from the processor. And for wildlife photography, what's the biggest advantage in those two sensors? Well, it's the readout speed. On the R5 is 15.5 milliseconds, and on the R5 Mark II, it's 6.3 milliseconds. This gives us now virtually no rolling shutter, which means better backgrounds when panning, and fast-moving wings just really don't have any odd shapes anymore. As far as the ISO differences, all the tests show an electronic shutter because that's all I shoot on the Mark II, and it's the only mode that really gets close to the frames per second results for the two cameras comparing each other at 20 frames per second. It's basically a quarter to a half stop better on the Mark II in electronic shutter. Now, can you really see that in your daily shooting? Oh, heck no. Does it help you shoot more in low light? Well, not really. It is a touch better, but not that major a difference, especially when you start processing DxO or other denoising programs. And we'll talk about image quality a little bit later in the video. We don't really get into that right now as far as low light. But where does this new sensor help with as far as low light? Well, it's in the autofocus performance. With this ability to read from the sensor better at low light, we get a better lock of the subject in that low light condition. And I did see this was on Barrow. I could lock up a bird or a fox eye in some pretty bad lighting conditions. It even locked up a fox under a building in almost complete darkness, and it found that eye, which was just incredible. And I'll probably put that picture up here, and it was in the last video too. The picture that is a little grainy, but the thing is, it still locked that eye. The original image, before I kind of edited a little bit, it's pretty darn dark. As far as dynamic range in electronic shutter, the Mark II is just a hair better again. And like I said before, I shoot only in electronic shutter all the time. That's because I get better FPS on the camera. On the Mark II, we also get 14-bit images versus the 12-bit on the R5. So better bit depth in the image along with a slightly dynamic range means a better image on the Mark II versus the Mark V. And my philosophy on dynamic range and wildlife photography, if you're so worried about it, just get your exposure right when you start, when you're out in the field, or get enough in the field that when you go to post, you know what you're going to get from when you're going to pull out those shadows and those colors. It's a pretty simple philosophy. It's really harsh, but it's really simple. Just get it right in the field. You don't have to worry about dynamic range later. Another plus in that stack sensor and being able to read faster is the frames per second we can achieve on this camera in RAW in electronic shutter. On the R5, we get up to 20 frames per second in a 12-bit image, and with the Mark II, we can get up to 30 frames per second in a 14-bit image. So in frames per second, we're kind of winning here on the Mark II. Now, for me, 30 frames per second is nice, but 20 is really more than enough, as I say. And the R5 achieved that 20 frames per second. But the issue with me on the R5 at 20 frames per second, and it was always a problem, it's why I never shot in it, there's no sound in electronic shutter on the R5. And I need that sound. I need to know when I hit that shutter, I'm taking pictures. There's many, many times with the R5 when I was shooting that with no sound, I'd hit that shutter, and I'd get back later and go, oh, I wasn't holding it all the way down, or I didn't get as many shots as I thought. So I always shot electronic first curtain on that camera, which dumbed me down to 12 frames a second. So shooting this one, really the minimum of 20 is where I shoot it most of the time. And the ability to shoot at 30 makes it really nice for wildlife photography. And another thing the Mark II has over the R5 is the way the camera handles pre-continuous shooting. And that difference is the Mark II shots are now in the camera roll right with all the other pictures. Instead of in a siloed off spot like the R5 had it, the R7, the R6 Mark, all those other cameras, they have pre-continuous shooting, but it silos them off in another place where you got to use Canon software to get those images out of that roll. And that just made it a pain, and I just never used it. So with the R5 Mark II, pre-continuous shooting is on at all times. So I can get those shots before I hit the shutter. Those times where I've got a pike barking, or I've got a bird taking off the water, or landing on a limb, or just comes in the frame real quick. If I've got that shutter halfway down, tracking it to start with, and I hit that shutter, I'm going to get those 15 frames at 30 frames a second, or those 10 at 20 that I would not have got before. And I had a lot of image on this camera that I would not have gotten. And a lot of times I was like, oh, I got that. And Don was shooting the R5 or the R7, and he didn't get the shot. He's shooting exactly the same thing as I did. Because I had the pre-continuous, I got that little bit more right at the beginning of whatever that little scenario was. So pre-continuous shooting is huge to me for wildlife photography. And yes, you get a lot more shots, but the opportunity to capture a moment that you would have normally missed because I really wasn't quick enough on that shutter, like I said before, it just makes your day when you get back and look at your image and you run through that and you see, oh, I got it. That's just so nice to get. This feature on its own makes the Mark II a fantastic wildlife photography camera. Just being able to get that interesting behavior of an image that you captured instead of just witnessing it at times. Just, oh, I saw it, but I didn't get it on camera. Really, really, really good feature. Okay, let's move on to autofocus. This is something that you guys really wanted to know. And the autofocus on the Mark II is much improved from the R5. The R5 had a great autofocus to start with, and seeing that we get better performance as Mark II is a very, very welcome addition. Where I've been seeing the improvement is in the initial acquisition. It constantly finds a subject very easily and really quickly. And hanging on to that subject is much better, especially when the bird gets behind a subject or close to the background confusion. Now, to record and show you the AF how it works on this camera through the viewfinder is pretty hard on the Canon cameras. This is a gripe I have on the Canon cameras. And this is a weakness for me for this camera. Most of you guys won't have this problem. But with the Canon cameras, when you do a HDMI out into the Atomos to record what the camera sees, I can't see through the viewfinder. And that makes it really, really hard to show you guys, especially birds in flight, what I'm seeing. Because what I have to do is I've got to look to this camera with something mounted on top and try to, which is higher than this barrel, this lens, and try to find it in the frame. So if I've got a bird that's really fast, I'm not going to be able to show you really, unless I'm just really lucky or I'm sitting on a gimbal, to be able to show you how this guy tracks the birds in flight. With birds in flight, I very seldom use a gimbal. There's times I do if they're repeating their behavior a lot, but most of the time I handheld my bird in flight. So it's really impossible to show you that bird in flight. It's really hard for me to show you a lot of the focus because it's really hard, especially the 800 millimeters I've got on this lens, to be able to look through that little screen and try to find that bird in the frame when I'm shooting out really small towards it. So that's something I wish Canon would really get fixed and really changed. I mean, Nikon's able to do it where I do it out and I can see through the viewfinder and I can see through the external recorders. If Canon would get that, I'd be very, very happy. So I don't really have any examples to show you in the short time I was able to get out and work with this camera of birds in flight. But speaking of birds in flight, this is where the Mark II shines from my experience so far. It really holds the subject really, really well. When we were shooting the sandhill cranes with the R5, when they flew really close to the tree lines in the background, I would get it to track the birds quickly and jump to it, but every once in a while we'd jump to the trees, back to the birds, back to the trees, back to the birds. Seemed like it held the focus plane where the birds were, but I was getting those little dots all over saying that I was hitting the trees also. But with the Mark II, it almost never happened. It stayed on that bird. It's very, very, very welcome change. To show you how much better the acquisition recognition is, I have an example to show you. This is just a simple mallard duck along a creek where I was getting test footage of the autofocus in operation between the two cameras. I was focusing on the background away from the birds and seeing how fast it would acquire the birds and lock onto that eye. And I ran into a situation that was really telling how much better the difference the acquisitions of these two cameras are. On the R5, when I tried to grab this duck on this log, instead of grabbing the duck when it came back, it would grab a small stick in the water that was right behind the bird. I tried this over and over and over using different exposures and other settings within the R5 to help the autofocus work better. But about 80% of the time or more, it would grab the stick and not the bird. I changed out the two cameras and shot the same bird, going to the far background, pulling back to the bird, and the R5 Mark II hit the duck 100% of the time. It never missed the duck. It came to the duck, never went to the stick. But like I said earlier, the autofocus of the R5 is very, very good. But the Mark II, I just didn't really have to worry about the performance as it just constantly locked up the subject and it pretty much stayed on it. Now, there are still situations where it doesn't matter what camera you have, that's just not going to lock on, you're going to have issues. Like when I was shooting this muskrat was swimming really low across the water, and I was laying down on the dock, and it was swimming towards me. He was going to swim under the dock with me. And as it's coming to me, with the autofocus, wouldn't hit it because there was a wake and I was too low in the water and I could barely see the eyes of the muskrat. So what I had to do is I had to hold the single point and keep single pointing that little muskrat all the way up to me. A couple times the autofocus would lock when I kind of jumped back to it, but it would jump back off to the water or something behind it. So I just kept doing the single point to get it. And you get the same issue when you've got a lot of brush and limbs with the subject behind the limbs or in some really busy subject areas where the contrast is not hard. But the Mark II did a lot better job than the R5 in finding the eye amongst those situations. Now on to video autofocus. This was a very much bigger improvement to me than the stills was between the two cameras. The R5 Mark II just was able to lock on better and stay locked on. Both cameras do a great job of hanging on, but the Mark II just grabbed much quicker and really helped much better on in-flight and moving subjects and through obstructions a lot better. Of course, if you have a subject that looks like the same as its background and doesn't really move, and the AF is going to get lost on both cameras, or actually all cameras. And the example I have, as I showed you before, was this loon that was back in some lily pads. It was such a close color and light fixture, and the bird didn't move as much, that it would at times drift off to a lily pad and back of the bird and back and forth a lot. But the video autofocus is much, much, much improved on the Mark II versus the original R5. On to image stabilization. In video, this is where it's much more improved. When the first time I hit the record button, I could really see the frame just stop swinging back and forth. I was hand holding it, I could see a little bit of movement, hit that button, stabilized, locked on. It was really, really obvious. When I A/B'd the two cameras, I could see the initial lock differences also, when that lock on with the stabilization, that is, when it would kind of settle down. And they are both great in holding the subject in place when recording, but the new Mark II really helped in those semi-shaky moments much better. But if you can't stabilize yourself and really hold your camera well and find some type of support, it's not going to matter between the two cameras. The footage is going to be all over the place. So good technical skills is still needed on both cameras to really hold that camera steady to help that image stabilization in video. In stills, I was seeing a little less motion blur in my Mark II images versus my R5 images, especially in birds in flight in the Mark II. But really, if you're having that type of issue, you just bump your shutter speed up anyway, and you kind of really negated that motion blur you get due to the image stabilization. So in stills, I'm not as worried about the image stabilization really, but I'm more worried about it in video. Keeping with the video, both cameras have 8K recording and all the other frame rates and resolutions, with a couple new ones and changes on the Mark II. Now the Mark II record up to 240 frames per second at 1080p, which we can't do on the R5, which gives you that more great slow motion goodness. And we can now record 4K 120 with sound now. On the original R5, you couldn't do that. You could record more 4K 120, but without sound. Both of those are, to me, for what I do, for the type of hybrid shooter I am, very welcome additions. And another big thing in video is the color grading that you now have on the Mark II. It has the addition of C-Log 2, and you can really tell the difference between C-Log 2 and C-Log 3 when you're grading the footage. More colors, more shadows, more highlights, things like that. You can really tell the difference in it. But if you're not using grading, you're not using the custom colors, C-Log 2, 3, those type things, just the standard colors out of this are really good. Like I said, I still haven't had anybody tell me from the video prior, the first day I shoot with, which video footage was the C-Log 2 and which was just the standard Canon colors. They're really rich colors, and they're really appealing colors to me that coming out of video out of this camera. Really, really nice. As far as the video image quality between the two cameras, to my eye, the Mark II is just a bit clearer and the colors are just a little punchier to me. It's not a massive difference, but it is a little bit noticeable to me, and it may vary what you think when you look at the video image quality and the colors and clearness and things like that. But to me, it just looked a little touch better, but not really enough to go, oh, this one's massively different. Hit rate. Now, this one, from my experience, was a factor that the cameras really started separating themselves again. My hit rate was good on both cameras, but using the Mark II was much better across burst. I was seeing less drift and missed focus with the burst, where I started the focus off in a good area. And what do I mean by that, starting off in a good area? Well, the R5 was pretty notorious. They did fix a little bit in firmware patches that in a burst, the first couple of shots you got, it was a little bit soft, but then after about the third or fourth frame, it really picked up, and it got better over time. But I also, with the R5, there was times in a burst, I would see a few frames that were just not as sharp as the rest of them. But with the Mark II, I didn't see that happen as much. I saw more times where I had really from first frame to last frame in a burst that was pretty much locked on that focus and stayed locked on that focus throughout the burst. So that, again, was another welcome addition, something that kind of really surprised me a bit more. I expected the hit rate of the two cameras to be about the same. But with that stack sensor, it makes sense why I was getting a better hit rate. Okay, on to image quality. Both cameras are great. Where the R5, to me, edged out the R5, which is a little bit more in clarity. Not sharpness, but more in clarity. I hope you understand what I'm saying there. As far as colors, it's still very, very close, but it did seem like the Mark II had a little bit more warmth and punchiness in the colors from the Mark II. But on both those two advantages, it's not much more than you can get with just balancing it out in editing. And we won't really be able to tell if there's a larger separation of the two cameras until we can get DxO back into the workflow. As with the R5, I was never happy with the way the images looked right out of the camera, right into Lightroom. And I always had to pre-process the image with DxO. Pretty much all the cameras I process with DxO. So once we get DxO working, we'll do a full video on the image quality between these two cameras so we can really look at it. But for now, with the unprocessed raw images, they both look really good, but I'd say the Mark II edges it out just a touch, but not a major difference. Other difference between the two cameras is the menus are updated on the Mark II, and there's small changes to them that's due to the new features and the streamlining that needs to be done to keep things logical. But you shouldn't have too much trouble or issues with those menus if you ever used a Canon camera before. There's some new noise reduction capabilities on the Mark II that happen in camera now. I haven't really tried those yet, but when I do, I'll pass that information along as to what it looks like. The Mark II also has some new image upscaling features that, like the noise reduction, I haven't really tested yet. And the Autofocus tracking, like to talk about later, I really haven't tested it yet, and I don't really plan on testing anytime soon. So tell me what your experiences are with the Auto tracking, or the Autofocus tracking is whatever they call it. And of course, there's a price difference in the two cameras. The R5, like as today of filming this, it's on sale for $3,000 right now. But it usually runs about $3,500, while the Mark II went up in price of $4,300 from the R5's original price of $3,800. So it went up about $500 from what the original list of the two cameras were. Now, there are other small things that are new in the Mark II, but I haven't looked at them really because they don't fit my workflow for wildlife photography, so that's why I'm not really covering them here. But if there is something you see you want me to compare between the two cameras I didn't compare, please let me know, and we'll cover that in a subsequent video later on. Okay, what's my conclusion of which camera is better, and should you upgrade? Well, the latter question of should you upgrade, I really can't answer that for you. That's really a you thing as far as your budget and what your shooting needs are. My advice is to rent one of the new cameras and test it out for yourself, and that's why I love Stewart's Photography here in Anchorage, as they have R5 Mark II and an R5 in the rental lineup. So if you're in Alaska visiting, or you come here, you already live here, go out there and rent it and try it out. They're a fantastic company, and I can't believe they already have an R5 Mark II in their arsenal for rentals for everybody. And the biggest thing at the end of the day, what matters the most for a photographer, is did I get a good image in the camera? So, will the Mark II give you a better image over the R5? Not really. You could use a 5D Mark II and get just as good an image as the R5 and the R5 Mark II. So what will the Mark II give you that the R5 won't? Well, from my experience, more of those good images due to that increase in autofocus performance, which leads to less toss-out shots. It also means culling is more difficult as I had more time and more in-focus shots though. And your confidence in bird in flight goes up way more because it's more reliable autofocus acquisition and stickiness, and that leads you to start shooting more birds in flight and going after shots you really wouldn't even attempt. And you end up getting more shots of that interesting behavior of your subjects due to the pre-continuous shooting function. The EVF, where you spend most of your life behind a camera shooting, was just much better to me. It just made targeting my subjects, especially in the very poor light and shooting conditions in the Arctic, much easier, and getting the exposure correct in all situations much more accurate to me. The most telling experience I had with the camera that led me to say, yeah, the Mark II for sure is a great upgrade, is when Don and I were shooting some sandhill cranes along the Turnagain Arm here in Alaska. Don and myself have been shooting the Mark II for a week prior to this day, and that morning I'd stopped by Stewart's to pick up the R5 so I could test it against the R5 Mark II and Don could check the camera out. When we found the cranes, Don slipped out of the Bronco and set up on the ground right next to the truck and started photographing the birds of the Mark II while I started setting up the Canon R5 so he could start seeing if it was the upgrade or addition for him to go to along with his R7 that he uses on a daily basis. Once I got the R5 set up, I told Don to hand me his camera set up, and I swapped out the camera on his lens he was using, and he went back to shooting the cranes, now using the R5. After about 15 minutes, Don popped up from the ground, back up to the truck to swap something out in the truck, and his first words to me as he pointed over to the Mark II, he said, yeah, that's the one, no question. Just the EVF clarity and brightness by itself was that it factor, and the reliability in the autofocus was the difference we saw right away. Both of those items really stuck with us over the next few days, A being the two cameras back to back. The better EVF, pre-continuous shooting being actually usable now, stickier and faster autofocus, sound and those higher frame rates and stills, and more reliable hit rate. These are all the things that we need as wildlife photographers to me that make this camera a winner for all of us, and it's a true upgrade camera from its predecessor. Is it perfect? No, none of the cameras are, but this one makes shooting very enjoyable and adds confidence to how you shoot on a daily basis. That's huge to me. And like I said before, will you get a better image if you get all of your shooting conditions right using the Mark II over the R5? No, but for me it's a lot more enjoyable behind the camera with the Mark II out in the field over the R5. Well, as always, if you found the video enjoyable or helpful, please subscribe as we have some more R5 Mark II videos coming very soon. Comparing the camera to the Z8, Z9, low light performance of the camera, video setups for the camera, image quality, as well as photo excursions out with the camera on our amazing trip above the Arctic Circle, snowy owls and Arctic foxes. Those are cool when you see them out in the wild. So, until next time, get outside and go run that shutter.